It was a hot summer afternoon, the sun beating down relentlessly on the sprawling construction site. The air hummed with the sound of drills and heavy machinery, the smell of fresh concrete mingling with the dust that seemed to coat everything. Workers were scattered across the site, their faces grimy with sweat as they labored under the watchful eyes of their foreman, a no-nonsense man named Victor Viper Morgan. Victor stood near the entrance, his arms crossed, scanning the site with sharp eyes. He had a reputation for getting things done, and his crew respected him for it. What they didn't know, though, was that the man had a past that none of them could imagine. In the far corner of the site, just beyond the scaffolding and steel beams, a new recruit was hard at work. His name was Jack "Hammer" Harris, and he was a recent addition to the crew. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always serious, Jack had joined the construction business after leaving the military, seeking a quieter life away from the chaos of battle. But quiet wasn't always in the cards for someone like Jack. As the day wore on, a group of bikers rolled into the site. Their bikes rumbled loudly, a mix of chrome and leather that screamed trouble. Leading them was a man named Deke the Duke Daniels, a notorious biker gang leader with a reputation for causing havoc wherever he went. Behind him, his crew, a ragtag group of men and women, revved their engines, creating a cloud of dust that swirled in the hot air. Deke had heard rumors that the construction site was a great place to scavenge materials for his latest custom bike build. His crew was known for making a mess wherever they went, but they didn't care much about the rules. As they parked their bikes near the main entrance, Deke swaggered over to Victor, his grin wide and cocky. "Hey, Viper," Deke called out, his voice booming. "We need some supplies for a project. I'm sure your boys won't mind if we take a little bit of scrap metal, right?" Victor's eyes narrowed, his face unreadable. He didn't like outsiders coming onto his turf, and he didn't take kindly to being disrespected. "You're not here to scavenge, Duke," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "Take your gang and get out of here." But Deke wasn't one to back down. He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the smell of alcohol and tobacco. "You really think you can tell me what to do? I don't take orders from anyone, especially not some washed-up soldier." Victor's jaw clenched. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but that didn't mean he'd forgotten how to handle trouble. But before he could respond, Jack "Hammer" Harris, who had been working nearby, stepped forward, sensing the tension in the air. "Problem, boss?" Jack asked, his voice low and steady. Victor glanced at him, then back at Deke. "These punks think they can take whatever they want." Jack cracked his knuckles, his gaze fixed on the bikers. "I'll handle this," he said, his tone sharp. With a slight nod from Victor, Jack strode over to Deke, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved. Deke, who had been sizing him up from the moment Jack appeared, couldn't help but smirk. Well, Deke said with a chuckle. "What do we have here?" "The big, tough soldier who thinks he can stop us." Jack didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake, Duke. You and your gang need to leave. Now." Deke's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "You think you can talk to me like that?" He reached for the chain at his side, swinging it through the air with a deadly intent. But Jack was quicker. Before Deke could even react, Jack grabbed his wrist, twisting it in a move that sent the chain flying from his hand. Deke grunted in pain, his eyes widening in surprise. "What the hell?" The bikers behind him hesitated, unsure of what to do. Deke tried to recover, but Jack wasn't giving him a chance. With one swift move, he slammed Deke into the side of a bulldozer, sending dust and debris flying in all directions. "Get the hell out of here," Jack shouted, his voice booming across the site. But the bikers weren't backing down. One of them, a tough-looking woman with a scar running across her cheek, lunged at Jack with a crowbar. Jack sidestepped her, his movements fluid as he grabbed her wrist and spun her into the dirt. The woman let out a scream, but Jack didn't give her the chance to recover. From behind, another biker, a hulking man named Clay, charged at Jack with a pipe wrench raised high. Jack ducked just in time, and the wrench slammed into the ground with a loud clang. Before Clay could react, Jack was on him, delivering a series of quick, precise blows that left the big man on the ground, groaning in pain. "Is that all you've got?" Jack taunted, wiping sweat from his brow. Deke, now furious, pulled himself off the bulldozer. His crew was down, and he couldn't believe what had just happened. "You're gonna pay for this," he snarled, reaching for a switchblade. But as he lunged forward, Jack caught his wrist again, this time with even more force. "I don't want to fight you, Duke," Jack said coldly, "but you're forcing me to. Leave now, and I won't make this worse." Deke's face turned red with rage, but he knew when he was outmatched. His crew was lying in the dirt, and he wasn't in the mood for more humiliation. With a final, venomous glare, he stepped back, his blade still clutched in his hand. "Fine. You win, soldier," Deke spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "But this isn't over. You'll regret this." With that, the bikers backed away, firing up their engines. The sound of their bikes roaring to life filled the air as they sped off, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. Jack stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but sometimes people didn't know when to back down. He glanced over at Victor, who was watching the scene unfold with an approving nod. "You all right, Hammer?" Victor asked. Jack nodded, wiping a smear of dirt from his forehead. "Yeah, just another day." Victor chuckled, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and amusement. "You might just be the most trouble we've had around here in a while, but I'll take you over those punks any day." Jack grinned. "I'm just here to build, boss. But I'll handle whatever comes my way." The crew, who had been watching from a distance, began to cheer, clapping Jack on the back and congratulating him for standing his ground. But Jack wasn't one for attention. He returned to his work, grabbing his tools and getting back to the task at hand. The bikers had learned their lesson, but in a place like this, who knew what trouble might come next? As the last of the bikers disappeared down the road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them, the construction site slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The sound of power tools, the hum of machinery, and the shuffle of workers filled the air again, though a lingering tension remained. Jack "Hammer" Harris wiped his brow, his eyes scanning the empty road where the bikers had gone. He knew something wasn't right. It was too easy. Deke had a reputation. He never backed down without a fight. Victor "Viper" Morgan walked over, still watching the road where the bikers had disappeared. "Something's off, Hammer. I've dealt with bikers like Deke before, and that was too clean. I don't trust it." Jack looked up, meeting Victor's steady gaze. "You think they'll come back?" "I'm betting they'll be back with reinforcements," Victor replied. "And when they do, it's not going to be pretty. We need to be ready." Just then, there was a loud crackling noise from the site's PA system, followed by the familiar voice of their foreman, Carlos "Ace" Ramirez. "Hey, everyone, keep your eyes peeled. The biker gang's back in town, and I've got a bad feeling about this. They're not done with us." Victor clenched his jaw. "Looks like you were right, Ace." Jack stood up, dusting off his gloves. "I'll keep an eye on the perimeter. You get the crew ready. We don't know what they're planning, but we need to make sure we're not caught off guard." Victor nodded. "Be smart. Don't let them drag you into something we can't finish." The air grew thick with anticipation as the workers, who had been nervously whispering, got back to work but with an eye on the horizon. It wasn't long before the unmistakable sound of engines echoed through the valley. But this time, it was louder, more ominous. Jack's heart sank as the sound grew closer. He glanced around, his eyes darting from one worker to the next. They were all on edge. Even Victor stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of calm but his eyes sharp as daggers. And then, they came into view. Not just the same gang. This time, there were at least twice as many bikes, roaring down the dirt road with more riders than before. But it wasn't just numbers that made Jack's blood run cold. It was the blackened, military-grade vehicles trailing behind them. These weren't your typical bikers. "Shit," Jack muttered under his breath. "This isn't just a gang war anymore." Victor shot him a look. "No kidding. They've got something else planned. Get ready." As the bikers screeched to a halt, the riders dismounted. But there was no celebratory jeering this time. Deke the Duke was there, but he wasn't alone. A tall, imposing man stepped forward from behind the bikers. He wore a black suit that contrasted sharply with the rough, worn leather jackets of the gang members. His face was hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, and a cruel smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. He carried himself with the kind of authority that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand up. "Who's the new guy?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper as he surveyed the situation. "That's Nathaniel Shadowgraves," Victor replied, his tone dark. "He's not just a biker. He's a mercenary with ties to some pretty heavy people. I've heard rumors that he's been hired to do things. Bad things." The mercenary, Shadow, smiled coldly at Victor. "You've got a lot of nerve, Viper. Thought you could just toss us out of here without consequences?" His voice was smooth, with an almost unsettling calmness to it. Victor didn't flinch. "You're trespassing, and you're a coward for bringing this circus to a construction site." Deke, now standing next to Shadow, looked slightly uncomfortable, but his bravado never wavered. "This is your last chance, soldier," Deke growled. "Shadow's the kind of guy who makes problems disappear." Shadow turned slightly, his hand resting on the hilt of a gleaming knife strapped to his side. "And I'm getting paid handsomely for it," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This site is ours now. You're going to step aside, and nobody needs to get hurt." Jack took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You can keep your threats, but we're not backing down." Shadow's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "You're making a mistake, soldier. The bikers might have been just an annoyance, but I'm not here to ask nicely." Without warning, Shadow signaled, and the mercenaries began to move into position, surrounding the construction site with a menacing precision. It was clear that this wasn't just about stealing scrap metal anymore. They had something far more sinister planned. "Get ready, everyone," Victor shouted, his voice sharp. "We're not losing this site." Jack sprinted toward a nearby stack of equipment, his mind racing. He had to think fast. There were too many of them, and those black vehicles weren't here for a friendly chat. He needed to keep the crew safe, but he also couldn't let these mercenaries walk all over them. As the mercenaries tightened their circle, Shadow's voice rang out. "You should have just let us have what we wanted. Now, we do this the hard way." Suddenly, the ground beneath the construction site rumbled, a low, distant growl vibrating through the earth. At first, no one could tell where it was coming from, but then, Jack realized, he wasn't the only one who had been preparing. From the far corner of the site, behind an abandoned truck, came a deep, mechanical roar. Jack's eyes widened. "Victor, what the hell?" Victor's expression darkened, and then he grinned. "Told you we had a few tricks up our sleeves." A massive, armored bulldozer roared to life, its engines bellowing as it rumbled toward the mercenaries. But it wasn't just a bulldozer. It was heavily modified, its frame reinforced with steel plates and mounted with a turret that could shred through concrete. The construction crew had been preparing it for a new project, but they hadn't expected to use it like this. The mercenaries hesitated for a moment, their confident postures faltering at the sight of the massive machine barreling toward them. But Shadow wasn't fazed. He held up his hand, signaling his men to hold position. "This is just the beginning, Viper," Shadow shouted, his eyes narrowing behind the sunglasses. "The bulldozer won't save you from what's coming." Jack grinned. "We'll see about that." The standoff intensified, and as the dust kicked up around them, it was clear that this was just the first round of what was about to become an all-out war for the construction site. But one thing was certain. Jack and his crew were ready to fight, and they weren't going down without a fight of their own. The roar of the bulldozer's engines filled the air, the sound so loud it seemed to rattle the ground beneath their feet. Jack gripped the steel frame of the machine, his pulse racing. This was it. There was no turning back now. The mercenaries tightened their grip on their weapons, their eyes flickering from the bulldozer to the crew members behind it. But Shadow remained calm, his cold smile never wavering. "You think you can intimidate us with this junkyard toy?" Shadow sneered. "It's going to take more than this to stop what's coming." Victor stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You have no idea what you've just walked into." Jack's fingers flexed, his mind working on a plan as the mercenaries closed in, their movements slow and deliberate. But Jack wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With Victor's guidance and the crew's backup, they could turn this site into a fortress. As Shadow signaled for his men to move forward, Jack pressed a button on the bulldozer's control panel. A deep thrum echoed as hidden compartments in the machine's side opened up, revealing a barrage of smoke canisters and flashbangs. Before the mercenaries could react, Jack threw the switch, sending clouds of thick, blinding smoke billowing out in every direction. The air was filled with the sound of disoriented shouts and confused footsteps. "Move now," Jack shouted, as the crew swiftly sprang into action. Victor was the first to dive into the chaos, using the cover of smoke to his advantage. His movements were fast, precise, as he disarmed one of the mercenaries, flipping him onto the ground with a swift elbow to the chest. The sounds of struggle and grunts filled the air as the crew engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the mercenaries, their training showing in every move. Amid the confusion, Shadow's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Retreat, now. Fall back to the vehicles." But it was too late. Before Shadow could react, the ground beneath the mercenaries shifted. From behind the cover of smoke, a large, armored truck revved its engines and plowed straight toward the mercenaries' black vehicles, crushing one of them under its massive wheels. The sound of metal screeching and engines dying was drowned out by the deafening noise of the collision. As the truck reversed, another crew member, Cindy Steele Roberts, grinned, holding a remote control in her hand. "I rigged their vehicles earlier. I knew we'd need a little surprise." Shadow's cold expression faltered for a brief moment, but then his eyes hardened with rage. "Enough of this." He lunged forward, charging at Jack, who was still at the bulldozer's controls. But Jack was ready. He pulled out a hidden taser from his belt and, with a quick flick of his wrist, fired a shot straight at Shadow's chest. The mercenary leader stumbled backward, his body convulsing from the electric shock, but he quickly regained his composure, his eyes narrowing with fury. "You think this is over?" Shadow spat, his voice low and full of venom. Jack didn't flinch. "It is now." With that, he activated the bulldozer's secondary function. The massive machine's scoop lifted high, and with a grinding sound, it swung like a giant hammer toward Shadow. The force was enough to send the mercenary leader flying backward, crashing into a pile of construction materials. Victor stepped up beside Jack, breathing heavily but with a grin on his face. "I thought we'd lost for a moment, but that was pretty sweet." Just then, the sound of sirens filled the air. Jack turned toward the horizon, seeing flashing lights in the distance. "Looks like the cavalry's here." Ace's voice crackled through the PA system, his tone victorious. "I called in some friends. Looks like you've got company." Shadow, now pinned beneath a stack of steel beams, cursed under his breath. His gang had been completely overwhelmed. The reinforcements that had been on their way were now in full retreat, scattered by the chaos and the crew's strategic defenses. The sirens grew louder, and the police vehicles screeched to a halt, surrounding the remaining mercenaries. With nowhere to go and no way to escape, Shadow's face twisted with defeat. "You've won this round, but don't think this is the end," he snarled, glaring at Jack and Victor. Jack stepped forward, his expression cold. "We've been through worse. You should have thought twice before messing with us." As the police took control of the remaining mercenaries, Shadow was hauled away in handcuffs, still muttering threats under his breath. His gang, now broken and scattered, had no fight left in them. Victor clapped Jack on the back. "Well, that was a hell of a fight. Didn't think we'd pull through at the beginning, but we did." Jack smiled, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "We've still got work to do, but for now, we've won." And as the sun began to set over the construction site, casting long shadows across the ground, the crew stood tall, knowing they had done more than just protect a piece of land. They had fought for their lives, and they had won. But deep down, they knew that this fight, this battle, was only the beginning. The mercenaries had been sent to destroy, but Jack and his crew had shown them one thing. They weren't afraid to stand up, to fight back, and to protect what was theirs. And whoever came next, they'd be ready.